I have a fascinating story today that was sent to me by my dear friend, Roman Krestina. It's about his father, Lubos Paul Krestina, who was born 4 years after the end of the First World War in 1922. He was born in Czechoslovakia, in a town about 60 miles from Prague. And his parents were God-fearing. His father was a well-known evangelist and Bible teacher that traveled throughout Central and Southeastern Europe. He preached in German and Czech and English, and he was a good friend of many well-known believers, people like F. Bruce and also Johann Warrens, who wrote the classic work on baptism, and Broadbent, E.H. Broadbent, who wrote the classic work called The Pilgrim Church, and Nathan Wood, who wrote a classic work called The Secret of the Universe, later republished as The Trinity in the Universe. Amazing men, these. And James Lees, who was also a great worker from Scotland, who labored in Eastern Europe and into Russia in those days. And he also published a Christian magazine called Words of Truth and Love. He grew up in this Christian environment, but although he was surrounded by godly people, they would come and stay in his home as they traveled through that region of Europe. He was more interested in sports than he was in spiritual things. He had become a believer, but he was distracted by the world of sport. And that was until he contracted polio, a mild form of polio, thankfully. But it sobered him up and made him realize that his life was not his own, it belonged to the Lord. And the Lord gave him full recovery from the polio and also a new desire to live for the Lord. In February of 1943, he was drafted as a slave worker by the Nazis and began working in a building Heinkel aircraft engines at a factory in northeast Prague. And providentially, he was able to stay with his family during the war years. However, it involved a long 70-minute commute each way to work and back, plus working 12-hour shifts, either day shift or night shift, 7 days a week. And with very little food, it was a very difficult time for them. Then, on May 7th of 1945, there was a communist-inspired uprising against the Nazis, and this caused the German army to come sweeping into Prague, and they took hostage about 180 Czech men and officers. Now, he had never borne arms for the Nazis, for the German government, nor for the Czech government. But he ended up being grouped in with the Nazis because of his doing work there, and they identified him with this uprising. He was not guilty of such a thing, but these men were taken to an abandoned castle some miles south of Prague, and there 2 days later they were brought out to face a Nazi firing squad. As he prayed, realizing that his young life was just about over, he heard a commotion and opened his eyes to see a tall gentleman coming through the gate with a Red Cross armband. And he walked directly over to the commanding officer, and he said to him, "Major, 2 hours ago, Admiral Dönitz signed an unconditional surrender of Germany to the Allies. If you do any harm to these men, you will not be treated as a prisoner of war, but as a war criminal." And this obviously shook this officer to such a degree that he actually arranged the surrender of some of the young Nazi soldiers into the hands of these men that he was about to have executed. And he and many of his men hot-footed it towards the American troops because they didn't want to surrender to the Russians. And as a result of that, his life was spared. And he writes in his little autobiography, 64 years later, I'm still astounded at God's amazing miracle. On a human level, I cannot understand how such a man could appear in the midst of a raging war at that particular time and place. After the hostages returned home, they learned that even the Czech Revolutionary Committee in Prague did not know where the hostages were taken. Also, no one heard of the Red Cross being in the area at all. He says, my only understanding of this miracle is based on Hebrews 1:14, of course, which speaks about angels being sent to protect those, to minister to those who shall be heirs of ultimate salvation. And then he also quotes Psalm 103, verses 20 to 22. Let me read that to you. Bless the Lord, you his angels, who excel in strength, who do his word, heeding the voice of his word. Bless the Lord, all you his hosts, you ministers of his, who do his pleasure. Bless the Lord, all his works, in all places of his dominion. Bless the Lord, O my soul. And so he believed that the Lord had supernaturally preserved him, protected him by this man who appeared as a Red Cross officer and yet was actually perhaps an angel in disguise. How often we've been spared, how often the Lord has rearranged circumstances to protect us, we probably won't know till we get to heaven. But we thank the Lord for this, and the story continues. They were able eventually to escape first of all to England, and then to Ireland, and eventually to the United States. So these stories that are woven throughout the history of the Christian church, how many times God has spared us. And we think of the words in Hebrews chapter 11, how God intervened and protected his servants. And we just bow and worship, and we say, Lord, we owe you everything. Not only that he would spare him from polio and spare him from a Nazi firing squad. And there are other stories in his autobiography as to how the Lord spared his life time and time again, but that he would spare his soul and save him. And we'll look forward to meeting this dear brother when we get home to glory.